Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Greater Seattle Tarot Meetup, and I'm Joy Vernon. And today we are looking at a holistic approach to the astrological chart. And as I was just mentioning, I've done this talk twice before, both times in 2017 for a couple different astrology meetups in Denver. So here we are, a holistic approach to the astrological chart. Here's our agenda for today, and we do have a lot to cover. First of all, we're going to look at Joy's way to read a chart, which of course differs from the usual ways of doing something. And I'll talk about what my definition is of holistic astrology. We'll look at blending symbols, which is one of my main approaches. And we're going to do that via tarot cards because I think the images are easier to blend than the abstract qualities of the astrological glyphs. Once we kind of familiarize ourselves with the process, then the astrological placements become easier to work with. We're going to look at the three primary things I want to talk about today in terms of finding this holistic quality are aspects, aspect patterns, and contradictory indicators. And so we'll cover all of those. And then I'll do very briefly this idea of finding the story in the chart. After that, we've got a conclusion, and that'll be the full agenda for today. And so Joy's way to read a chart, or the joy of astrology. And so this is my start with astrology. That's my chart there. And I'm self-taught, and I have a kind of bad habit of making things up as I go along. They tend to work, so I tend to get away with it. I probably started studying astrology in earnest around 2008 or 2009, inspired by my tarot studies. But I want to say that even though, and because I did my first chart delineation in 2009, and in 2010 I was teaching astrology. So the whole arc of me getting into astrology happened very quickly. But I do want to give some background so that you recognize that I didn't just like fake my way through it, because that's not what happened. I learned tarot in 1991, started doing client readings that same year. Started doing like psychic fairs that same year, and then had my first official one-on-one tarot client in April of 1992. Going back to those early years, I was interested in stargazing and watching the moon cycles, doing ritual work around moon cycles and things like that. I would read my horoscope if like a newspaper was around and I happened to be on the page where the horoscopes were. I would definitely read my horoscope. And there was a time when I was in a living situation where somebody actually subscribed to the newspaper, so I read my horoscope every day. And there were some times when it was like weirdly accurate. Like I remember one saying, "You will study mythology today," and it was like, oh my God, I study mythology every day, and I can't believe that they said this. So that was kind of a fun one. But sometime around probably 2004, maybe a couple years earlier, I found a moon signs book in a coffee shop. And I'm an Aries sun with a Cancer moon. And so the Aries sun stuff in the horoscope column never really fit me very well. Just reading what Aries meant never really fit very well. Once I discovered that I had Cancer moon, that made a huge difference. And I was like, oh, that explains a lot. And that's when I thought, maybe there's something going on here that I don't know about. Maybe there's something worthwhile in astrology. Meanwhile, again, just so you don't think that I really was some kind of, I don't know what, in terms of like really learning this quickly, I had learned other things. I had explored bits and pieces that were related to astrology, such as learning the planets when I was studying Kabbalah, because they fit on the tree of life. I learned the houses in order to do a 12 position tarot spread. So those are things that I had already come across and already familiarized myself with before I was like, oh, let's actually go into astrology. it was probably around 2007 that I pulled my chart for the first time, and maybe a little earlier. It's as I really was trying to find some good dates, and it's really hard to figure some of this stuff out because of my tarot background. When I did pull the chart, I was really focusing on the elements in the chart. And because of how my chart looks, which you can see over on the left here, I was really interested in aspect patterns. I hadn't, and to me that was fairly normal. I've got what we call a kite configuration, and I just kind of assumed that most astrological charts had some kind of symmetrical pattern to them, which of course turned out to be not true. So then around 2008 is when I really started having to learn astrology as part of my training in the Golden Dawn. One of the officers of the temple, the group's resident astrologer and my mentor, gave me an initiation gift of my chart. Now, he studied the March McEvers style of astrology, which is like 3 volumes of books that delineate every single placement, every single combination. He had this really lovely, thorough, attractively bound astrology report for me. It had the standard interpretation and then a short paragraph of a few lines of things that he thought about for each placement in my chart. But as I read it, it sounded stilted and broken. It was full of contradictions. I didn't think it sounded like me, and more importantly, it didn't sound remotely like the work that I had done with my own chart. So, Joy's way, the dawn flies before the sun, and that'll give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm going with this. And this is the story of Daphne and Apollo illustrated there, and that's, I think, by Waterhouse. And so the dawn flies before the sun. So I decided to prepare a chart for my mentor for his birthday. And this was June 2009, and it was my first formal chart delineation. Here's his chart right here on the screen. And so by examining the 4 elements in the chart and noting aspects, I saw in this chart a tree growing in a river. So if you take a look over here, I consider, again, I was looking at the elements, and I had learned these things based on and associating with tarot. So Saturn is an earthy planet, and Capricorn is an earth sign, and Venus can be considered earthy as well. In the 10th house, since it's naturally associated with Capricorn, I think I was looking at that as being earthy. So I have an earthy planet in an earthy sign, in an earthy house, opposite to a planet that's in an earthy sign. And all that earth, for whatever reason, I could argue different things now, but it made me think of a tree, something rooted, something grounded, something solid. And the tree, then there's this Cancer, which is a water sign, and Venus can be earthy, but also she feels emotional, which can be watery to me. That seemed kind of watery. The moon felt watery to me. And so that tree was in a river. And so when I started putting those together, I thought, well, what's a story of a tree and a river? Well, Daphne and Apollo. And so I wrote up this kind of like a 2 or 3 page single space write up for my friend, talking about his entire chart from the perspective of the story of Daphne and Apollo. And I had the sun was Apollo, and Daphne was represented by the moon, and she is associated with Artemis, and so that made sense. You know, I talked about the sun Neptune, and the Neptune North Node, and so the Sun South Node combination. And I addressed all of these things. Even the Neptune, which is associated with divination, Daphne was turned into a laurel tree, and laurel leaves were chewed in order to produce divinatory statements. And that is because Apollo rules, is one of the rulers for divination. And what happens in the story is that Cupid messes things up, and he shoots one of his arrows into Apollo and makes Apollo fall for Daphne, but Daphne is not interested in him at all, and so she's running away, trying to get away from him, and and her father is the river god, and so she runs to the river and says, "Father, Father, help me, help me, Apollo's after me, he's chasing me." And so the river god changed her into a tree, and she felt her limbs slow down, her legs extended down into the earth and formed roots, and she wasn't able to move. Apollo caught her, but she wasn't a woman anymore, she was a tree. And so I never, the whole story I think is fairly tragic because nobody really wins. Everybody kind of loses out, but that's Greek mythology for you. So I sent this to my friend, and he was like, I've never seen a chart read like that before. So I'm like, okay. So I tried to then, right around the same time, the tarot meetup that I led, the Denver Tarot Geeks, they wanted to do tarot and astrology. And so everybody there was experienced astrologers except for me. And but it was my group and I wanted to lead it. And so I decided to introduce some of these methods that I'd been working with. And it did not go over well. The participants were sharing those knowing looks across the table, and then everybody left the group. So I'm like, okay, this is not. And they were like, Joy, why don't you read a book on astrology? Here's a couple to start with. So I buckled down, and even if you look at some of the titles that I read, you can see that I still wasn't totally going towards standard astrology. But The Inner Sky by Stephen Forrest and Handbook for the Humanistic Astrologer by Michael Meyer were probably the first actual astrology books that I read. Meanwhile, every time the Golden Dawn group interviewed an applicant for our temple, we would look at the person's chart to see if they'd be a good fit for the group. And I was studying astrology, so they asked me to chime in and share ideas that I had. But again, my mentor was a main astrologer for the group. Then I started eventually doing regular short delineations for each applicant that we interviewed. And we did interview a lot of people. People don't always, at least in our Golden Dawn group, a lot of people join. Not very many people stay because Golden Dawn work is difficult. There's a lot of study involved. It's a lot of difficult work. But we accepted a lot of people. And eventually the officers became comfortable with me taking on more of a role of the resident astrologer for the group. And then they started teasing me about how spookily accurate my readings were. And actually thought that I was scaring away certain people because I hit things so closely and so deeply in just short kind of 10-minute kind of reading. So we were doing we had a meetup. The Golden Dawn group had a meetup that met at a metaphysical store in Denver. And after one of our meetups one time, one of the officers said to the owner of the store, he said, if you want an astrologer, you got to get Joy. And she's like, okay. And so I actually got my first store gig as a reader, as an astrologer, even though I'd been doing tarot since, for, I don't know, at this time for 20 years, my first store gig was actually as an astrologer. So now I'm going to share some of what I've learned with you. So what is holistic astrology? So, and this is a little bit of my definition. I looked, the last time I did this talk, I forgot to look this up, but I did look it up this time. And there is an astrologer, a very well-known astrologer who uses that term, holistic astrology. Noel Till uses that. And I have not read his book. Like I said, I'm much better at making up my own way of doing things than reading other people's ways. So I don't know what he says about holistic astrology. Now that I've discovered he's got that book out on it, I might see if I can get a hold of a copy and maybe check out what he has to say. But that said, if you don't want to call it holistic astrology, you can call it whatever you want. I'll take suggestions. It just, to me, I just wanted to look at the chart as a whole is why I use that term instead of breaking it down into parts. And that's what we're going to talk about right here is cookbook versus holistic astrology. And you can see the cookbook in my mind is this ugly black and white boring food, and holistic is like this intense connection between people with all this water, which represents the emotional depth and the soul connection that arises from this kind of work. So cookbook astrology, and that is a fairly commonly used phrase, and it means to follow carefully defined recipes or pre-established meanings for all chart placements. It's a memorization-based technique in which you learn each planet in each sign. So the sun in Aries means this, the sun in Taurus means this, the sun in Gemini means this. Then you have to go to the moon in Aries means this, the moon in Taurus, the moon in Gemini, and on through all the planets, all the signs. You have to, the sun in the first house means this, the sun in the second house means this, and which I just don't have the patience for. You have to learn all that, every aspect. I don't know, sun square moon means this, sun square Mars means this. It's like, who has time for all that? So anyway, and plus, and on top of that, cookbook astrology tends to sound rigid, uninspired, and textbook. It doesn't even give you interesting things to say. So delineations done in the cookbook style often, and this is the worst of it, I think, those delineations tend to be full of contradictions. And that's a thing. It's really hard to because you cannot you cannot write a book that covers every single permutation out there. And so you can't memorize every single permutation. And so what you end up with are contradictions that you don't know how to resolve because you haven't been trained to resolve those. So holistic astrology, according to Joy. So holistic astrology seeks to discover the unity of the chart. And when practicing astrology holistically, every contradiction in the chart is resolved into the truth of the individual. Holistic astrology tends to produce inspiring, deeply resonant, and compassionately honest delineations. Holistic astrology is healing. This was right before the first time I gave this talk, and so I included it, and I still think it's interesting, so I decided to continue including it. And this was on July 1st of 2017. A client, and this was unbeknownst to me, I did not know that he had done this. He had his aura photo taken before and after a astrology consultation with me. And it was a day of a psychic fair I had an office when I was in Denver. I had an office at a metaphysical bookstore, not the one that I showed earlier, but a different one. And and I might have even been, I think I was actually in the psychic fair that day, but a number of clients had pre-booked for readings. And so if a person pre-books for a reading, I would do it in my office. Otherwise, I was just taking whoever walked in at the psychic fair. So he had pre-booked. So he was in my office with me. So it was a private reading. But because it was a psychic fair, they had the aura camera there. And so he had that first photo done, and you can see that there's not a lot of color. There's just kind of the dull orange, not even a bright orange, kind of a dull orange through here. And then after the reading, that all that dullness really brightened up. We even get some white down here. This purple comes out, which is a spiritual color. We get some green and some yellow up through here and down here. The colors and brightness in the second photo indicate a lightening of his aura and deeper spiritual and emotional connection is what his wife studies this stuff and knows about it. So that's what she told me, that it indicated a deeper spiritual spiritual and emotional connection. Now, to be fair, the guy's dog had just died, literally. And so a lot of the before photo stuff did have to do from him being very much in a very bad place as he came in. And again, he had pre-booked that appointment. And so he wanted to ask about some career things, but he came in with a really heavy heart because of his dog. But you can see how much the reading lightened up his energy during the session. I don't really know anything about aura photos, and if somebody wants to challenge me on the validity of it, I'm totally fine with that, because I don't do them. I've had them taken. It's hard to avoid it when there's a camera set up in the shop where you work. But I was never that interested in them. Mine always turn out blue and purple, which I think are pretty colors. So it seemed to appeal to, in that sense, it appealed to me. If you are interested in aura photos or know more about it, then that might be something that is interesting to you. And so, how to read holistically. Holistic astrology considers the chart to be a blueprint for the highest expression of the self. Not something to be faded necessarily or to rise above. And I had a student in one of my classes saying, "Oh, well, we're supposed to rise above our chart." And I don't believe that. And a lot of people do like to, well, not a lot, but there's also a contingent of people that really like to say we're fated to express our chart. And I guess I do believe some of that to an extent, but I don't think that our fate is ever a difficult. I guess it can be difficult and challenging, but I don't think it's ever negative. And so I always think that there is a highest expression of the chart, and that's our job, is to find that and to express it in our lives. Although there can be many techniques and subtleties employed in holistic reading, today I'm just going to focus on 3 specific approaches: the aspect patterns, and the contradictory indicators. So, blending symbols. One of the keys to reading holistically is to be able to blend symbols, the way you might mix pigments to create secondary or tertiary colors in painting. Tarot cards, because they are less abstract and more imagistic, are easier to blend, easier to work with using this. So we're going to start with that, just to kind of sample it, kind of find out what it's all about. And so let's take a look at the Empress card and the Tower card and see what happens when we blend them. So I'm going to advance in the slides into the next slide. I invite you guys to unmute yourselves and to share your ideas on this combination of cards. In tarot, we usually read cards one followed by another. And so and I do want to say that to me is really important, that the meaning is different. If the Empress is followed by the Tower, that is a very different meaning than the Tower followed by the Empress. And it's a different meaning from the blending of the two. Every once in a while, I'll come across a blog post by an astrologer, or a Facebook comment, or not by an astrologer, by a tarot reader, a Facebook comment by a tarot reader, where they're like, well, just move the cards around until they make the best sense, or if you're seeing a difficult combination, what would happen if you put the better card at the end? I mean, as an exercise, I think that's great, but as a tarot reading, it's no longer a reading if you start moving the cards around. I really think that the order that they fall in is the order that they should stay in. I do think that there is a degree to which going ahead and saying, okay, now that we see what's laid out for you, now what would happen? What do you want to occur? How can we achieve that? What if we started moving things around? That, I think, this is how things are going, and this is what we can change. I think that is a perfectly valid reading technique, and not just an exercise. But I did want to kind of clarify that up front. So So here's our first combination to look at. We've got the Empress followed by the Tower. Who wants to speak up and chip in and say how would you read this combination of cards with the Empress first and the Tower second? I know nobody is confused by this, so you're just being quiet.
Miscarriage.
Oh, good. I like it. That's a great interpretation. Yeah. Empress, which is frequently represented as pregnant, and then Tower, which is destruction. That could be a miscarriage. Absolutely. What are some other interpretations that we might look at?
I would say maybe the calm before the storm.
Oh, good. Yeah, that works too, because there is there's a very relaxed feel to that Empress. The way she's on that nice, it looks like a stone bench, but with the cushions and everything. Yeah, there's a peace to that, and then the upset that comes with the Tower. So yeah, the calm before the storm. Let's go on to the next one. This is Tower first, followed by Empress. What would we look at here?
Maybe she doesn't want to be pregnant.
Yeah, the upset, definitely the upset of a pregnancy test. And now that I look at the Tower, I'm like, that does look a little, that's in the shape of an EPT a little bit. And it's just like, okay, well, that's an upsetting thing. And she'd rather have her own authority than follow through with that. Perhaps that could be. Yeah. What else? Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of, it's like, okay, it's that upset that comes from pregnancy, that upheaval.
Okay, yeah.
Or how about repeated miscarriages followed by getting pregnant and carrying it to term?
I love it, because that is...
We're so dark today! Dear God, how many miscarriages can we have?
I've read that. If I had that comment, I've had clients, and you always are so hesitant to say something, and miscarriages are shockingly common. People don't talk about it, but it's really common. And I've had a lot of clients where I'll see a combination like this and say, well, I'm wondering if you've ever had a miscarriage before. And they'll be like, oh my God, I've had so many, and I really, really, really want to be able to finally have this baby and carry one to term. And boom, that combination would absolutely suggest that would be the likely outcome of the current or next pregnancy. So yeah, that's a good one. What other ones can we get here? And I'll stop for in a second and look at the chat.
I can read the chat for you.
Okay,
Camille
thanks.
is saying the change will bring creativity, and releasing your old beliefs will bring on your new creativity.
Good. Like it. I like it.
And Mickey is saying the first sprout after a wildfire, successful vegetation after a drought.
Perfect. I love it. Oh, very good. That's awesome, because we're going to go into some of that too. Okay.
I've got one more thing too.
Yeah.
How about the ugly duckling turns into a swan?
Oh, beautiful. That is really cool. That's a really cool interpretation. And we can take that one pretty deep too, in terms of, what you have to release and let go of. So blending, when we blend them, and this is what I had come up with. The Empress and the Tower combined was, at first, back in 2017, when I was trying to put this together, I was like, I don't want to have to try to Photoshop the lightning bolt from the Tower onto the Empress's wheat. And oh my God, that would be so much work. And so I Googled lightning striking a field of wheat, and sure enough, I found one. And so this is Fred Wasmer. I just found it on the internet, so I put it on here. Yeah, there's I think the Empress can represent fertility, but the Tower can represent the ejaculative power, and can represent insemination or the fertilization of something. And so when you get them together, and not even one in front of the other, just like totally blended and totally combined, then we get this sense of fertilizing and the lightning does do something to the earth, and I didn't bother to look this up, but I do remember reading there's something that lightning does when it hits the ground, and it actually does it releases some negative ions and stuff, but there's some other stuff that it does to the ground that does affect the quality of the earth. What are some other thoughts that you guys have in terms of what would happen when we totally enmeshed these symbols and it wasn't a this then that, it was just completely enmeshed?
I'm not quite too sure I understand.
Oh, okay. What happens when we totally like mix them together like paint, and they become one color that's a different color than either one of them?
Your mom dies.
What?
Your mom dies. Tower Everest.
Oh, mom dies. Good. Okay. Wow. Rather than saying your mom dies, which is a little more sequential, maybe we can say your mom is either, you've got a very inspiring mom, if we want to go positive, or you've got a
Dementia.
Dementia? Is that what
so yeah, what happens when like the lightning firing in the brain stops? It starts. Like what happens to us when that gets off? Is that
Excellent.
dementia?
Yeah. Excellent. I was going to go more for a mother that is electric, that she has either a temper, either a strictness. I'm thinking tiger mom, or some kind of strictness or outbursts of anger. But yeah, that would be a good example of blended, not an event like your mother dies, but your mother is always like having lightning going on around her, whether it's anger or whether it's bipolar, yeah, something like that. So yeah, so those are examples of blending. And that's a good way of trying to explain it. It's an ongoing experience of something that involves both those aspects, even if they're contradictory. So it's not one thing happens and the other thing happens, it's both are blended. So it's not so much that there's the mom and then she dies or whatever. I do like that example. But more that the mom always has the lightning coming out of her.
She's just always been dead.
She's just always been dead. That could work in terms of a person could have ongoing trauma due to the death of their mother, and that's that kind of blended. I always feel this way when I think of my mother, when I think of mothering, when I think of things that we would associate with nurturing or any of that. So the mother has always been dead. Whether or not she's literally dead, even all that. Yeah, these are really good ideas that we can definitely work with. One of more simple ones that I came up with, just baking bread, because there's a transformation that happens with baking bread that takes the flour and the water and the yeast, and the thing that you have before and the thing that you have after are very, very different. There's a lot of transformation that happens in baking bread. And then I also, like somebody else did, I also came up with the idea of the seeds that germinate after a fire, that there is an activation of the germ of the seed. So those are just some ideas to play with and to kind of experiment with. So, and this is one thing that somebody came up with when I taught this. I also did this in an astrology class that I taught. This is maybe from last year. And it's lightning as the exclamation point. And this is Black by E.E. Cummings. And the poem goes: black against white sky, trees which from dropped leaf ago goes whirling. And just the exclamation point shape of the poem combined with that sense of the whirling leaf the letting go of the of that nature empress kind of nature oriented thing. So anyway, so just a variety of ideas. And of course, Venus is the Empress, and the Tower equals Mars. And so it's easy to do, and we see those images, and we see the wheat field, and we see the lightning. It's harder to do when we just have those little glyphs in front of us. But this is what I encourage, is to try to find the characters, find the, if you want to work with the tarot cards, find images, find ways of expressing these things with images and working to blend them. Or even if you already know the common meanings for the symbols, work on blending those symbols when you're looking at an astrological chart. In one of the 2017 times when I taught this, at this point in the lecture, somebody asked, is it easier to learn holistic astrology? And my answer is yes. Rather than memorizing volumes of astrological combinations, the way I teach is I only teach 17 symbols. If you can get these 17 symbols like firmly entrenched in your brain, everything else in the astrological chart is a way of blending those symbols together into different combinations. So if you can learn to blend, and then you can learn those 17 symbols, the entire chart opens up to you. And this is on my YouTube. I'll mention that again later, but this is on my YouTube channel. You can look at that talk. And so aspects. So for this presentation, we're only going to look at the Ptolemaic aspects, which are called the major aspects. And these aspects are the conjunction, the sextile, the square, the trine, and the opposition. And I know that a lot of people get really excited about some of the minor aspects, but this gives you more than enough to work with. It'll keep you busy just doing this. And then once you get these really down and really solid and secure, then going on to the minor aspects, if you want to start working with them, that would be a good way to do that. And so the very first chart that I have for you is Marie Curie. She has a Rodin rating of AA, so it is a highly accurate birth time. And of course, she was the Nobel Prize winning physicist and chemist. And this is her in her lab. And so one of the ways that most astrologers will approach a chart when they initially look at it is the sun, moon, and rising. And thanks to Kira at the Astrology she just posted on Twitter the other day, let's just call it SMR, and then everybody will know what we're talking about. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. So often a standard approach to the chart is to start with sun, moon, rising, or SMR. The sun is considered the self, the moon is the soul, the emotions, or the inner aspect of self, and the ascendant is considered the mask, first impression, or how others see you. And thanks Stephen Forrest for the idea of the self, the soul, and the mask. But by noting aspects to these important placements and blending the symbols, we can find deeper meaning. And so here's Marie Curie, and I'll say, I guess I'll say this is another thing that kind of got me really interested in this approach to astrology. I did take an astrology class, maybe in 2010, and the guy was doing my chart as an example, which is fairly typical when you're taking an astrology class. And he was talking about my moon in Cancer, and trying to express how I was based on that. And I understand that you have to, especially when you're teaching, you have to really limit what you address in a chart, but he wasn't hitting me at all. And same with my horoscopes. Most discussions of just Aries don't fit me at all. Why? Because I have the sun conjunct Saturn. And so sun conjunct Saturn is not the same as just plain sun in Aries. And sun in Aries square to the moon in Cancer messes up the sun, it messes up the moon. It's a bunch of stuff. And so that's why I realized it's like you cannot read one placement at a time. You can only read correctly when you combine the elements of the chart when you make them work together instead of separating them off into their own little categories. And so looking at Marie Curie here, we look at her sun, moon, and ascendant. We've got that sun up in Scorpio on the chart here. And this one's a little bit hard to see. I've got it in whole sign houses. And so the ascendant is right here in Capricorn. The midheaven is here in Scorpio, and the sun is actually this blue tick mark right here. It's at 14 degrees Scorpio. The midheaven is at 18. It's this tick mark here. Then we've got Saturn and Venus at 25. Those two tick marks are right here. And then Mars is in here at 29. So the sun is here, and then the midheaven, and then Saturn and Venus and Mars. And so we have, and then the moon is down here at 16 of Pisces. We have the sun at 14 Scorpio, and the moon at 16 Pisces. And then we've got Uranus over here at 12, almost 13 of Cancer. And so we get this really nice grand trine in water here. And so if you look at just this part of it, we see her sun and moon, we see Scorpio and Pisces, we see that they're trine to each other, which is an easy relationship. There's a generosity and a sense of ease and movement that happens with those grand trines, and a lot of flow that we see in a chart like this. But when we go over to the rising sign, we've got Capricorn. Now, Capricorn is very strict. It's Saturn ruled. It's going to come off as very business-like. And we know that Scorpio can be fairly secretive or private. And so that might flow into some of this too, especially with the moon in here. Some of this ease might be more in her private life and less in her professional life. But that ascendant in Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. But where is Saturn? Saturn's right here in Scorpio. It's conjunct Venus. And if we keep going, Saturn is the ruler of the chart using the Hellenistic technique of the ruler of the ascendant being the ruler of the chart. So Saturn rules the chart. And so even though there's this beautiful, easy grand trine in water, Saturn's a chart ruler. And what planet rules Saturn? Well, Mars does here in Scorpio, and Mars is the final dispositor of the chart. And that means no matter where you start on the chart, eventually you follow from one sign to its ruler to the next sign. So for instance, if we start with the moon in Pisces, it's ruled by Jupiter, using the traditional rulers. In Aquarius, which is ruled, again, Aquarius traditionally is ruled by Saturn. Saturn is ruled by Mars. We can go other places. If we go to Pluto in Taurus, that's ruled by Venus. In Scorpio, ruled by Mars. We always end up at Mars, no matter what planet we start with. And so Mars is the final dispositor. And so that's a pretty, that's a much more challenging, either way you look at it, she's got Saturn, the difficult planet Saturn, as her chart ruler, and she has the difficult planet Mars as her final dispositor. And so a lot of her life, even though there's all this ease here, ends up being much more difficult. And we can see that even because both Saturn and Mars, both of them are square down here to Jupiter. So her good planet is being basically attacked by her two difficult planets, both of which are fairly prominent in that we've got the chart ruler and the planet that's a final dispositor. And so we can see all this difficulty in contrast to this ease. And one of the things that especially with Mars being the final dispositor, one of the most basic, like the very first line in the Wikipedia article about her is that she was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. She was the first woman to for quite a number of things. The first woman to teach at the Sorbonne in Paris. She was the first woman to do a number of things. The first person and the first woman to win, I believe, 2 Nobel Prizes. And she is still the only person to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different fields. But the thing is, due to being a woman, she was not allowed into the scientific societies that would have given her support, that would have given her connection and comrades, that would have given her that would have just supported her in her work. And that takes us back to this Venus and Saturn conjunction, that the femininity of her is being overshadowed by the masculine, the father paternal strictness, and it always comes back to the male, and so you can just see that right away. Even though she has all this ease in her chart, there's a lot of difficulty. It has to do with her being a woman, literally in between the two difficult planets, enclosed by the 2 difficult planets. And if you just start with the chart and just go kind of one thing at a time, you don't really get to that very quickly. It's noticing how these things relate, and then seeing how this relates contrary to that. And it even looks like a scribble. Just going over those lines just feels like, whereas if you go over these lines, it just feels there's this movement to it. Let's go on to the next one. So chart 2 is Christo. And he's got that Rodin rating of A, and he's an artist that's known for environmental works of art. So in the holistic reading style, you don't necessarily need to start with your usual sun, moon, and ascendant. And of course, obviously, as a reader, it's important to note those. That's one of my faults as a reader, is that a lot of times I don't even address that. And doing all those psychic fairs all those years, you often are in a room where you can hear somebody else doing a reading. And so I always heard the other astrologer doing his readings, and he would always start with their sun, always, 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 without, he'd be like, your sun is in Taurus. Taurus means this. And I'm just going, oh my God, that person knows their sun is in Taurus. A person knows what Taurus means. I tell people, I'm like, you probably know more about your sun sign than I do. You've lived it your whole life. I'm not going to bother stopping there. But I'll just dive straight into the meaty stuff and won't waste any time with that sun, moon, ascendant, unless it's part of the meaty stuff. So, and my fault being that sometimes I'll come out of a reading not remembering what somebody's sun sign is, even because I didn't spend very much time with it. If it didn't stand out as being extra important. So, although as a reader it is important to note those things, this approach to the chart is not about analyzing and cutting apart the placements, but about searching for natural connections to launch from. So, noting the standout aspects is a great way to start a reading and to quickly find the heart of a chart. So let's even postulate and anticipate what might we look for. We're looking at Christo, and don't cheat by looking ahead. If you did download this is the thing about doing an in-person thing where I don't give anybody the slides. Don't look ahead. What might you expect to stand out for a world famous artist? What kinds of things would stand out for somebody like that? What might you think to check before you even look at the chart? What would you think? Oh, I'll bet there's something interesting there. Oh, I'll bet that planet is going to be interesting. What would you guess?
Well, I think it depends on the style of art that he's doing. So something that would be sort of like Banksy type. I would definitely see a Venus Uranus.
Good. And that is a very it's a perfect point, and something I forgot to mention. He's known for environmental works and large site-specific environmental pieces where he integrates usually fabric in a landscape, and they're very big. He's the one that draped the Reichstag in fabric. He did in Colorado, he did Rifle Gap, the that curtain, that orange curtain over Rifle Gap over the highway. He was going to drape the Arkansas River, but his piece kind of controversial. They prevented him from doing that. He set up the umbrellas in Japan and California, things like that. So keep going with your interpretation with that new info.
Yeah, I would still say a Venus Uranus, but given landscape, I'm not sure if he would have maybe a Venus and Taurus. Like when I'm thinking landscape, I'm thinking something earthy and with textiles as well.
Yeah,
I'd definitely see sort of a Taurian energy there, but it could be Moon and Taurus for all I know. But definitely a Venus Uranus, or definitely a prominent Uranus there.
Yep. And what else? Anybody else have any ideas?
Maybe he has something in his fifth house.
Fifth house for creativity. Yep. And what else for the really large works and known for reputation for large works?
Leo.
Could be Leo.
Leo.
Yep.
Maybe Aquarius in like 10th house, or Leo in the 10th.
Yeah, something that brings out the unusualness of the style that he works in, or brings out the recognition of the stuff that he does. Those are good things to start with.
Jupiter in the 10th. Oh. If
What?
there's Jupiter in the 10th, if there's some sort of connection, again, maybe perhaps with Venus, I could see like Jupiter and Leo in the 10th would be perfect. But
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're looking at. And so what do we have, but you're not using whole signs, not in the 10th, but using quadrant houses in the 9th. We have his midheaven and his Jupiter and Moon. Jupiter and Moon are in the same degree. They're partile. They're both at 14 degrees of Scorpio, and the midheaven is a few degrees away. And so Jupiter conjunct the midheaven, and that's that really large stuff conjunct that career point of the midheaven. And looking at it as in the 11th house, I do think that because it's environmental, I think the 11th house is usually associated with community. And so the midheaven in the 11th is normally going to be read as a career that is based on interacting with the community. And he definitely had to interact with the community of any place that he went to do something, because he could, a painter can just stand in their basement and paint, and it doesn't matter what anybody thinks, but he had to get permission to do things, and he had to, fill out a lot of paperwork and talk with a lot of people in order to get his work done. And whoever called Uranus and Taurus for the environmental works, and the whole Jupiter Moon opposition to Uranus down here in that earthy, beautiful, beauty-oriented environment and earth-oriented Gaia. Taurus is Gaia, and so Uranus, in fact, he's having an Uranus. He died this year. He just died in May, but he would be having his Uranus return. So he died. Yeah, he died on his Uranus return, probably. I think that's age 84, something like that. But at any rate, so good calls. We do have Venus over here in Leo. So a lot of people were noticing Leo probably stood out. 10th house, this is interesting. We'll come back to this. 10th house is Libra. And it's got Mars in Libra, and he worked as a team. And we're going to look at that more in a little bit. So going forward, Gene Roddenberry, and the next one, another AA Rodden rating. He is a television screenwriter, and he is, of course, a producer and creator of Star Trek. And there he is with the model of the originals, NCC 1701, no bloody A, B, C, or D. So tips and tricks. Tighter aspects are more significant than those with a wider orb. Trick, reduce the orb in your software program. And I do this quite a bit in astro.com. There's a place where you can indicate orb, and you can set it from 0 to 150% of what their standard is. And so I'll knock it down from, like, assuming that their standard is 100%, you can knock it down to like 80%, 75% to tighten up the orbs and take away extraneous stuff that's not as that's less relevant. Or you can, if you don't have any aspects, very few aspects, you can loosen the orb by setting it to 120% or something like that. Out of sign aspects have different symbolism than aspects by sign. If somebody's got a conjunction that Mars, we just looked at 29 degrees of Scorpio, if there was something at 0 degrees or 1 degree of Sagittarius, those Mars and that other planet would be conjunct. But when they're out of sign, even if it's tight, you got to take that into consideration. That really changes the energy, because the conjunction is about they're so much the same. But even if there's just that one little line that changes between the signs, it makes each of those have a lot more independence instead of being really enmeshed. So out of sign aspects, and that applies to any aspect, not just the conjunction, have a different symbolism than aspects by sign. Give less weight to your out of sign aspects. Remember to eyeball aspects to points and objects that the software doesn't draw aspect lines to. And if you're using Astro, it doesn't draw the lines to the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, the nodes, or Chiron. I don't like to add the aspects to those things because it makes the chart look sloppy. There's too much going on. But I do eyeball, and take a look at if something would make an interesting aspect or turn a trine into a grand trine or something like that if you added in something that that isn't already marked. And again, you can adjust the settings in your software to add those aspects. In Astro, there's something to do this. I think it's a chart style. You can have it's called Astro Dienst with MCAC aspects or something like that. There's another checkbox where you can add aspects to Chiron, and there's a checkbox for aspects to all, but that's where it gets really sloppy and just becomes a mess. And so here's Gene Roddenberry. And so the very first thing that we notice is the shape of the chart. It's a really interesting shape here. And it looks to me like an airplane wing. And he was a pilot and flew planes. I think even like he was in the military and flew planes. So that's a really interesting thing that you're not ever going to find in any kind of cookbook astrology. It's just like, if you see a plane wing in a chart, go ahead and ask them if they've ever flown a plane. You might be surprised, or maybe they just have a lot of interest in planes or something like that. Yeah, you'll never quite know unless you ask. So let's look at, one of the things that catches my eye right away is that he's got his Jupiter and Saturn down here in Virgo, but they're right over the MC-IC axis. The MC is at 18 And then Jupiter is at 22 and then Saturn at 23. So the IC is down here at 18 Virgo. And then Jupiter and Saturn. So those two planets are opposite his MC, which is often associated with your reputation or your career direction. I mean, he had a good career without a doubt. But the original Star Trek only lasted those 3 seasons. So probably, yeah, it's probably a little bit of bad luck over the years, trying to find his way with his midheaven, with his career. And the midheaven in Pisces ruled by Jupiter, which is then applying to a conjunction with Saturn. It wouldn't have been that easy necessarily to realize the dreams that he had. Anybody want to point out anything interesting in this chart?
Looks like oh no, I was about to say he was born just after a full moon, but that's not going to be quite as significant as the full moon. So.
Right. Yeah. But still, it's still a good call because the moon moves 13 degrees in one day. So he was born like the day after, late on a day when the full moon was early in the day, or the day after a full moon. So that still counts. That still counts. Yeah. There's almost a full moon there.
I'm looking at also all the conjunctions. The ascendant Pluto. And obviously there's Venus in there too. So the Venus-Pluto, little bit far in orb, but and when I think of Gene Roddenberry and sort of that, I'm not a Star Trek geek, but sort of like that aspect of humanity, I'm seeing like the Mars-Neptune conjunction there. Sort of like working for humanity, putting your energy towards humanity, but also in Leo, we're looking at it from a creative viewpoint. The Mercury Sun.
Yep, Mercury Sun.
And then also the Moon Uranus, which again, you can kind of see that, humanity or that element of being more humanistic than because it's obviously Venus Uranus or Moon Uranus and in Pisces.
Yeah,
so I'm seeing just those quite a number of conjunctions.
Yeah, and one of the things, again, eyeballing things, we also get that moon is quite tightly trine to the ascendant. And then Uranus is trine to Pluto, and so we get that moon Uranus trine to the ascendant Pluto, and Uranus is the sky god, and so literally his soul, the moon, is conjunct the sky god, and trine to that Cancerian emotional expression of the ascendant and of that Plutonian transformation. The chart ruler using the ruler of the ascendant is the moon up there.
In the ninth.
Yeah.
So,
in the ninth.
That's space exploration. Yeah.
Yeah, the exploration, the pushing boundaries where no man has gone before. It's just right there in the chart. So some nice things there. Let's keep going. I've got to be brief on each one of these. Aspect patterns is the next thing that comes up here. And the aspect patterns, we've a couple times have been mentioned already. So let's take a look at what they are. Hold on just a second. So an aspect is usually between two placements. And so it's, not just two planets, because if you've got two things that are conjunct and then they're aspected to another thing, that can be, but they're, a placement one in one position and then another placement in another position. So the aspect is between two different positions. In contrast, and aspect patterns occurs when there are 3 or more positions that are geometrically configured. So your basic aspect patterns include the grand trine, the kite, the grand cross, the T-square, grand sextile, rectangle, and stellium. And we'll take a look at those here. So the grand trine, we saw that in Marie Curie's chart. That activates the same element. It's 120 degrees apart, so it forms this equilateral triangle. And we're seeing here moon in sorry, I can't read that. Virgo, moon in Virgo over here to Mars in Capricorn, and the sun in Taurus. And so that would be, that's 3 Earth, all 3 of the Earth signs, and that makes the grand trine. The grand cross activates the same mode. And so in here, we've got all planets in cardinal. We've got Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. And so a grand cross activates the same mode. You can have a cardinal cross, a fixed cross, or a mutable cross. The grand sextile, which would be, it's a fairly unusual pattern to get because it's a lot of placements, but it activates the same polarity. In this case, we're seeing Cancer, let's see, so let's start here. So we've got Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, Scorpio, and Capricorn and Pisces, and those are all the feminine or yin signs in the chart. What's a little more common, again, this one's not as common. We can get a bisextile, which would be just one segment of that, like half of it, where 3 of the positions are activated. And so we might get this, you know, Cancer, Virgo, Scorpio, all 3 of those. That bisextile, which is another triangle, but a smaller one, that is that's a similar thing to the grand sextile. It's part of it and it activates the same polarity. So then coming down here, we get the kite. And this is also in Marie Curie's chart. She had the grand trine. When there is the bisextile at the bottom of it, that creates the overall shape of a diamond or a kite. And so that takes the grand trine and it kind of, I call it grounding it out. It grounds it out into another sign and gives it a little bit of a stability. It's like somebody on the ground holding the cord to that kite. Whereas the grand trine can kind of just spin off into space. The kite grounds it down into another sign. The T-square is 2 squares plus an opposition. It's another triangle, but this time we're looking at a right triangle, not the equilateral. And so we've got this square between these 2, square between these 2, and an opposition here. Again, like the grand cross, it activates the same mode. And then your rectangle, which is another variation of your grand sextile that's more likely to appear. And that, again, is going to be 2 sextiles, 2 trines, 2 oppositions, and will activate that same polarity. So you'll either have a fire air rectangle or you'll have a water earth rectangle. And the stellium is multiple planets, usually 3 or 4 in the same sign or house, and that activates a single sign and gives it extra emphasis. So going back to Marie Curie, because we noticed that she has that kite configuration. So how do you choose what to work with in a short reading, or where to start if you're doing a longer reading? Patterns that include the sun and moon take precedence over other patterns. Big patterns, such as the grand ones, the grand trine, grand cross, grand sextile, take precedence over smaller patterns. Challenging patterns, based on the difficult aspects, like the squares and oppositions, challenging patterns like the grand cross and the T-square will take precedence over easy patterns because they are more transformative in our lives. The easy patterns are the trines and the sextiles. So your grand trine, your kite, your bisextile, your rectangle, those are all easy patterns. Patterns with personal planets take precedence over those with the outer planets, and patterns hitting the angles of the chart, particularly the ascendant and midheaven, will have more significance. And remember to consider the orb, how far apart if it's tight and they're close together, or the aspect itself is tight in terms of degree, and whether the patterns are in sign or out of sign. So here again is Marie Curie's chart, and so we saw that she had that kite configuration, and so a lot of that, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that her bio that I read specifically said she had a great relationship with her father. So here's our trine, right? Which is ease. Where's her father? Her father's right over here. He's not in the grand trine, but he's in the same sign as the sun, which is here at 14 degrees of this grand trine. So her father is over here, Saturn, and in the same sign. Is like she had a great relationship with her father. She had a great relationship with her brothers and sisters. Brothers and sisters and siblings are associated with the third house, and that's where her moon is. And her sister is through working with her sister that really got her launched into her own career, because she had some kind of job and she paid for her sister to go to Paris to study. And then after her sister got her degree, she, I guess, started maybe working or something. And then Marie was able to go over and join her. Somehow that worked out. So it was a benefit to her too. And then it says she got along great with her children, which is the fifth house. Look at all of this is part of, and of course, her husband, who shared the Nobel Prize with her in the first one that she got, 1903 maybe, and he's the seventh house. And so we just see, it just says that right in her bio. And what do we see but easy relationships between all of that stuff, the siblings, the children, the spouse, even that it's kind of it's a little out of range, but even the father figure is there. And how does this grand trine and water ground? It grounds via Pluto in Taurus, and it takes all of that moving energy and anchors it down into that solid earthy sign, and pulls in this really fascinating Pluto, Lord of the Underworld. And that's basically what she did with really highly transformative work that she did. She worked with elements that were literally transformative. They killed her, which is part of Pluto's significations. So yeah, some really interesting ways of kind of pulling the chart together. I just want to touch on Hawaii really quickly. So when we're looking at aspect patterns, we're going to go into Hawaii Takata, and she has a really significant T-square, and she's got Mars at 10 degrees of Virgo, which is square to almost everything she has in the first house. They had to shrink the type down. There's so much in there. That first house, this is what we call stellium. There's many definitions for stelliums. This one absolutely counts. It is everything. She's got her north node tight conjunction to Venus. She's got Uranus. She's got Mercury ascendant. She's got Jupiter in there. Chiron is in there. Even if we just count the planets themselves, she's still got Jupiter, Mercury, Uranus, and Venus in there. And so that's a distinct stellium. And then she also has that T-square, and to get it tight in orb, we want to go with Uranus at 13 and Mercury at 16, and then over here to Pluto at 16 and Mars at 10. That's where that T-square really happens, is right here over to Pluto up to Mars. So what can we tell? Let's actually work with the stellium, because this to me is the most clear indicator for her chart. She's Hawaiian. She was born in Hawaii of Japanese parents, and her parents owned some kind of business. She ended up marrying the bookkeeper at her parents' business. And meanwhile, her parents went back to Japan. They were from Japan. And then her husband died at the age of 34. She had 2 daughters. Eventually she worked herself practically to death and trying to support her kids, and eventually got quite ill and ended up going back to Japan and being quite ill, and eventually she wanted to get treatment there, and ended up getting Reiki healing done. And that's when she learned Reiki and ended up bringing it to the West. And so just starting with some basic interpretations, how might we see that expression of that story in this chart?
I see a huge concentration of energy with the stellium, and it's interesting how it goes. So, with it being in Sag, being incredibly expansive, but this huge amount of energy, and then right opposition to Pluto, who is as focused as you can get.
Yeah.
And then obviously with Mars as well. So again, focusing that energy more. So it's almost everything in her chart.
Well, and one of the things too that's really interesting with this is that what she did is that she's American, she was born in Hawaii, but she introduced a foreign philosophy, treatment, energy healing system into the US. And Sagittarius is associated with foreign people, foreign places, and foreign ideas. And it's associated with expanding something and spreading it. And she took that foreign idea with all this energy here and spread it throughout the U.S. because after World War II, first of all, with Japanese sentiment being really negative at that time, and all the restrictions that the Japanese were under, they took all of their traditional all their traditional practices, healing practices, but all their cultural practices went underground in Japan. They weren't allowed to do any of their traditional stuff. And Reiki was among the things that went underground in Japan at that time. And so she brought Reiki to the US, and eventually a student of her students brought it back to Japan in the 80s. And so it really spread around the world due to her, which is really kind of beautifully expressed in this chart. Going into the next thing, contradictory indicators. Some astrologers follow the rule of 3, whereby 3 examples in a particular indicator must appear in order to consider the signification strong. This means to find something expressed 3 different ways in the chart. However, sometimes you see something expressed, but then find something else that contradicts it. So these contradictions can make chart reading more difficult. Which one is right? Now, and what usually happens is that a lot of people, when they're reading a chart, they fall apart at this point. They're like, well, you've got this, but you've got this, and I want to find which one is stronger. And that's what they say. And you find those people posting on the Facebook groups. It's like, well, I've got this one, but I've got this one. Which one is stronger? Which one is going to take charge of this situation? And it's not about that. Those contradictory indicators are your key. key to really finding the heart of the chart and to really getting in there and resolving them into the unity of the individual. And so we blend the symbols to discover the truth in that chart. So examples of contradictory indicators would be a strong planet in aspect to a weakened planet, such as a dignified planet in conjunction with an ill-dignified planet, or a benefic opposite a malefic. We might get benefic or dignified planets in bad houses and vice versa. Indications of an inner focus expressed outwardly, such as a nighttime moon being at the top of the chart, the high noon position in the chart. We might get those Scorpio planets, which are always considered to be very secretive, again in the first house or at the top of the chart, representing a lot of outward expression of that that otherwise what we might consider secretive energy. These are just a few examples. As the more you do this, the more you'll find those contradictions. And like I said, a lot of people will just gloss over those things and be like, well, let's just not pay attention to this. It's contradicted somewhere else. But really engaging that opens up really interesting delineations that tend to be more accurate and relevant. And I think this is one of the, again, I think this is a key for really connecting with somebody. And once you dive into it, you find the truth of the individual and you find what truly makes sense for them, because you've able to discover the unity of the contradictions that are expressed in their chart. So chart 6. So this is Jean-Claude. She is the wife of Christo. And so she is also an artist. She's known for environmental works of art. Up until like the 90s, Christo's name was on all of their artworks. And that was due to the fact that that they wanted to have a simpler branding and make it a little bit easier in terms of the bureaucracy that goes along with doing the big kind of stuff that they were doing. And so it wasn't until the 90s, I believe, that they started adding her name on it, because they were total partners from the beginning. So they were a husband and wife team, and they are astro twins. Jean-Claude was Christo's wife and his creative partner. They were born the same day and year in different countries. Same day, same year, but different countries. They met in Paris in October 1958 when they were both age 23, and they just hit it off immediately. They met because he was painting her mother's portrait, and that's how they met, and they started working together. So again, let's see what I have. Yeah. So before 1994, the art Christo and Jean-Claude did together was always ascribed to him alone and not to her. In 1994, all the art they had created was retroactively credited to both of them as Christo and Jean-Claude. Christo's chart clearly sets him up as recognized in his field and fully realized in his goals. We already looked at that. We saw that Jupiter moon conjunction at the midheaven. We saw the some other things that really indicated how well recognized he was for the work that he did. So now that we know that actually all this time, his wife Jean-Claude was in the background, and was there in that background for many years, what might you expect to see in her chart? They were born the same day and the same year, so their charts are going to be pretty much identical. In many ways, their ascendant is different. What differences? Well, and that's one question to think about. What differences will there be? And then let's start taking a look at the contradictions, because we've got people same day, same year, but there's a lot of difference to their charts, and explains a little bit of how they ended up working together. So what can you think of? What might you look for in her chart, knowing that she was a support to him and not getting the credit for many years, even though they both were creating the ideas?
Where the planets are, they'll be in different houses.
Yep, they'll be in different houses. Yeah.
And so there will also be, because they're ascendant, descendant, and MCIC are going, the axes are going to be different as well. So then you can look also perhaps at planets aspecting those axes.
Yeah. Yep. What are some things that we saw think about what we saw in Jean-Claude and think about what we might expect to see with Christo. Think what we did see with Christo already and what we might expect to see with Jean-Claude in terms of, we saw him with that Jupiter midheaven conjunction. You know, what would we expect to see with her? What kind of emphasis is she going to have? Is she going to have the same recognition that he had?
I wonder if there would be a moon, her moon to maybe his midheaven or something, just because I'm thinking support versus actually getting the spotlight. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering about moon in there.
Yeah. What else? Anybody? I feel like I'm having a conversation with one person here. I might be going too far into astrology for your typical tarot meetup, and I apologize if so.
Oh, I wonder about her Saturn as well.
Okay, good.
If there's if his Jupiter is there, I wonder where her Saturn is in terms of her perhaps doing a lot of work but not receiving the recognition.
Yeah, and those are all really good ideas, and thanks for kind of being persistent in carrying on this conversation with me. And so here she is. And so what do we see? Her ascendant is over here in Sagittarius. Now, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, and she's got the same moon and Jupiter conjunction. Of course, it's the same day, so she has the same conjunction, but now it's in the 12th house, and the 12th house is out of sight. And where's her midheaven? Her midheaven's up here in Virgo conjunct Neptune. And so Virgo is administrative. And so did she probably do a lot of the administrative work for the team? I would imagine that she probably did. Now, looking over here, what do we see? Her sun is in the 7th. And the 7th house is a house of partnership. So she had, what else did she have?
Neptune and Virgo on the MC. I could see that almost being sort of a martyr type, a deference to somebody who's much more powerful, much bigger. Neptune and Virgo I see as sort of a somewhat of a martyr aspect.
That's an awesome interpretation, especially because it fits the tarot cards. Neptune is the hanged man and Virgo is the hermit. And so if we have the hanged man and the hermit together, she sacrifices herself for and stays for him to be seen as the only one. I also think with Neptune, I think of the mysticism of Neptune and the kind of, to me, that kind of goes over into imagination. So I kind of wonder if she had a lot of the kind of the vision, the imagination of doing some of this stuff. And it is really interesting that when he met her, he was doing portrait painting. And then the first exhibit that they had together, and they worked together from the beginning, the first exhibit of their work together was starting to do things that were wrapping objects with fabric and some of the other things that the environmental stuff, site-specific stuff. And so how did he go from portrait painting to doing these other things? Were they always his idea? Or was she even instrumental in triggering some of those ideas for him? I don't know. And I haven't really studied them, but I think it's interesting to look at. Let's keep going. And I always love to explore this stuff. And it's always fun to go and research it a little more later. I always try to do some research, but then I always open up questions when I look at the chart and I'll be like, I should go look that up and find out more about it. So that's Christo. And I want to touch really quickly as we come into our last 10 minutes here and finding the story in the chart. And I did this, I did it based on the elements. And I said that in the beginning. And in the previous iterations of this talk, I didn't come back to it again. And I want to do that because I do think it's a really useful technique, and especially for tarot readers that are more used to working with story and imagistic approaches to understanding something. I think it's a good way of working. And so this is my chart again. And the thing that I noticed with my chart, of course, is this kite configuration. But the other thing is, and part of the definition of a kite, now of course I had no idea about this because I didn't know this was a kite. I didn't know any of these things. What I saw was these blue lines connecting water signs, Pisces and Cancer and Scorpio. And so that seemed like water to me, or a lake. And then this red thing, which was Mercury and Venus up here and Uranus down here. And Uranus is the sky god and Mercury is air. He's communication and expression and that kind of stuff. And you can see Mercury in Pisces explains why I talk the way I do. And so, and just suddenly like totally lose track of my thoughts. They just disappear, they dissipate, which is Mercury in Pisces. And so I have this airy planet and the sky god, another airy planet. And so air in tarot is a sword. So I saw with this water and in these two air planets, I saw a sword in a lake, which of course we all know is from the Arthurian legend and the Lady of the Lake who gives Excalibur to Arthur. And so that is the story that I could see, was this air sword being lifted out of this lake. And it's relevant to me as a communicator too, because with Mercury and Pisces, now that I understand astrology, I can say, well, I have Mercury in Pisces, it's in its fall, it doesn't express itself as well. It expresses itself more emotionally and more kind of spiritually or imaginatively and less literally, and all that kind of stuff. Or I could say that my voice, which is my sword, arises out of a lake. And that to me, even though it's basically saying the same thing, and that the lake is the emotions and the imagination, when you put it like that, you're communicating in a story way with your astrological client. And so to be able to say that, my voice stems from, a lake of emotions and imagination is a really powerful thing to say to a client. I continued to work with this, and I actually found had forgotten about this, but I had actually done, right around the time I did that write-up for my friend, I also did a write-up of my own chart. And this time what I looked at was, again, I still saw the sword, but this time I saw a shield but because it was a watery shield, it was a mirror. And so I saw the sword in the mirror, and that reminded me of Perseus and Medusa, and that he had to use, I think it was, if I remember correctly, I think it was Athena's breastplate or Athena's shield or something like that, which was mirrored. And he couldn't look directly at Medusa to kill her, because anybody that looked at Medusa would be turned to stone. And so he had to use the mirror to attack her so that he could kill her. And the story goes on, and it out of Medusa's decapitated head comes Pegasus, and he rides Pegasus and finds Andromeda and saves her from the monster and all of that kind of stuff. And Perseus and Andromeda is the constellations that I use kind of for my branding for my astrology page on my website. But this is it. And I felt like if I looked directly at a problem, especially with my voice, I would be turned to stone by it. And so if I was able to look indirectly at it and see it through this mirror, then I was able to handle it and deal with it. And again, to know that, to be able to see that and apply it to your own psyche, to understand, this is what happens to me when I come up against problems. This is how I deal with them. And through seeing it in a story, when you can do that, you can really, you can find such a deep understanding of yourself and I don't know, there's something about finding a story that legitimizes whatever experience you have. One of the things that I've noticed working, I didn't teach because my initial the first time that I taught this, I had such a negative reaction to it. I didn't teach it for a long, long time, but I have slowly started teaching it again. And of course now, I don't have any problem at all, and people respect me. They didn't that first time though. And so I started teaching it slowly. And the one thing that I have found is that a lot of my tarot students, a lot of my astrology students are not as well versed in mythology as they would like to be. Remember that this is your story. And so it doesn't have to be mythological. Yes, I do like to study mythology, but your story, your chart speaks to you with your stories. So whatever are stories that you love, those are probably the stories that you'll find in your chart. Start with the simple things. Start with elements. Start with the things you already know from tarot: water, fire, air, earth. Start with your shapes that you see. This looks like a sword. This looks like a lake. You know, this looks like a bowl, or this looks like a tree in a river. You know, start with those things and start to put together, okay, if these things came together as a story, what might that story be based on the things you already know? You know, your chart's not trying to, it's not trying to confuse you. It's not trying to veil itself in secrecy. It wants to express itself to you. So it's going to be something you're already familiar with, and work with that in terms of discovering the holistic part of your chart, the overarching story that can be found in your chart. Conclusion: liven up your chart delineations by employing this holistic approach. Attempt to find the unity of the chart. Practice blending the symbolism of aspects. Work with those standout aspect patterns. Notice which ones really catch your attention. Work with those as the initial approach to the chart. Don't try to start with your sun and blah, blah, blah means this, and your moon means this. Just jump straight into those aspect patterns and unpack the chart that way. Integrate those contradictions. Don't push them aside. Integrate them. You will really be shocked at how deep you can go once you start to integrate the contradictions. Blend them. Just like we saw that Empress and Tower, and we could understand them when we put them next to each other, but when we really enmeshed them, they opened up in a profound way. Based on the 4 elements and the shapes that you see in the chart, use your imagination to find a story. That Learn Astrology with only 17 symbols is on YouTube, and you can find that at Joy Vernon Astrology Tarot Reiki on YouTube. I have a class that is up on Thinkific called Intuitive Astrology. If you register for it, the very first class is free, and it is the 17 symbols. It's got the handouts and the video and all of that. And that's at joyvernon.thinkific.com. And then you can go to /courses/intuitive-astrology. So thank you for attending a holistic approach to the astrological chart. Find out more at my website, joyvernon.com. You can book readings there and find more content than you could possibly imagine. Stop by my blog, completelyjoyous.com. Follow all of our great events here at the Greater Seattle Tarot Meetup. And of course, subscribe to me on YouTube, Joy Vernon Astrology, Tarot, and Reiki.
Thanks so much. This is really, really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.
Have a great weekend.
Yeah, bye.
Hi.
Bye.
It was fun. Thanks.